Mindy is a licensed clinical social worker specializing in mental health and addiction treatment and is the founder and executive director of the Utah Reduction Coalition. Mindy started the first legal syringe exchange in the state of Utah and has done extensive work on harm reduction, drug policy, opioid overdose prevention, awareness, and treatment. Mindy also continues to work to educate the community, stakeholders, and policymakers about therapeutic substance abuse and harm reduction. She is certified in psychedelic assisted therapy, as well as several other cognitive, behavioral, and trauma therapies. Mindy is the host of the podcast, Therapeutic Madness. She owns a private practice, Life Changes Counseling in Heber City, Utah. Mindy, where can we find your podcast, Therapeutic Madness?
It is on YouTube. It's on Podbeam. Currently, our social media manager is working on making sure it's on all the different podcast platforms.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I just thought I'd make sure that we could all find that after today. I'll let you take it from here. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Gabe. Okay, so hello, everyone. It's always kind of strange when you're on Zoom because I can't see all of you, but I see messages coming through too from people, and that's really cool. And I love you guys. And I'm super grateful to be here today and to get to talk about these important topics and to do it from a platform where, it's actually being taken seriously. So that's really great. And I'm really excited to be a part of this. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about harm reduction in psychedelics. And so we'll just jump right in. So how do I change my page? Do I just say click? And some people click it. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, click. Next page. Okay, so many people don't know what harm reduction is. It sounds like it's really self-explanatory, but from a definition perspective, harm reduction is a practical set of strategies and ideas that are aimed at reducing the negative consequences associated with substance use, and that includes psychedelics and any other kind of substance that can have an effect on your body. And we all use harm reduction every day. Sometimes when people hear the term harm reduction, they're like, that doesn't apply to me, but it does because people use seatbelts, sunscreen. I mean, the ways that people try to reduce harm in their lives is endless. Next page. So what I'm going to talk to you about is, I couldn't change this this picture, but I would rather it says substance settings, set and effect. But so I'm going to talk to you about these three areas because they're kind of the way that we frame things from a harm reduction standpoint. Next screen or next slide. Oh. Okay, so there are many different types of psychedelics. Some are plant-based, some are man-made or chemical-based. Some of our plant-based ones are, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's a decent one to start with. So plant-based, we have psilocybin, which are otherwise known as magic mushrooms. Ayahuasca, which is, it's a derivative that comes from a plant as well, and it's taken in a different way than magic mushrooms are. It's done through ceremonial processes, typically ibogaine, peyote, and mescaline. The peyote is typically used in Native American ceremonies. I've heard of mescaline being used in ayahuasca ceremonies as well. And then on our man-made side, we have things like DMT, LSD, which is otherwise known as acid, ketamine, and MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy. And MDMA, that's one that kind of, it borders. Some people consider it a psychedelic, some do not. But from a clinical perspective, there is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trials that have been going on for over 5 years. I think it's almost 6 years now. And so as a clinician, I consider MDMA a psychedelic. Next slide, please. So pre-consumption. Oh man, I put in little animations here so they fly in. Okay, whoever's clicking for me, get ready to click. Okay, click. So before you consume any psychedelics, I'm so sorry, I should have clicked it myself. You guys can all fire me later. So the first thing before you consume, you want to do an assessment of somebody's physical health, their mental health, and some other things. And the next presentation is about assessment and integration. So I'm not going to go deep into assessment right now. One thing you want to ask yourself, have you taken psychedelics before? Do you know what you're going to be expecting? Do you know what the effects are supposed to be? Do you know the proper dosage? Next. It is extremely important to know what you're getting. So from a harm reduction standpoint, people who've heard me talk before have heard me say substances are not illegal because they're dangerous. They're dangerous because they're illegal. Because when things are illegal, people cannot access them through safe pathways all the time. And that is what causes a lot of problems. Like specifically in illicit drugs, it's one of the biggest causes of overdose and death. So knowing what you're getting, who you're getting it from, exactly what you're getting, and its typical effects is important to know. Next. So knowing what you're taking and how it's supposed to be taken, especially with psychedelics, there's certain psychedelics that are supposed to be taken in a certain type of way, right? And it doesn't mean you have to take them in that way, but I think that if you're looking for the best experience, the most spiritual experience you can have, and the safest experience that you can have, then you should probably try to take it in the way that it's been taken and served by indigenous populations for hundreds of years. And I think that that will help anybody to have a better trip. Knowing your desired strength and effects, this is incredibly important too. Knowing what dosage is appropriate for you, for your size, your metabolism, knowing what you're trying to do. So for instance, if people are eating or taking psilocybin, some people microdose that and take in very small doses. Other people do things like take a hero's dose, which is 5 grams or more. If you're taking 5 grams or more, you need to know that you're off on a journey. You're heading out on a journey, and you need to be safe and prepared for that. And if that's not what you were going for, then you took too much. So it's incredibly important to know how much you're taking and what kind of effects you're trying to get so you can take the right dosage for that. Click. Next. And like I just said, knowing your dose, but also, especially with things like psilocybin, mushrooms can look like they weigh a certain amount, especially to somebody who's had a lot of mushrooms, but you should always weigh your dose. You should always weigh your dose so you know for sure how much you're taking, because otherwise you're just guessing. And that's not always the safest way to go about it. And for me, this is about safety. You know, if we're not safe, if people aren't necessarily they're looking for, and so making sure that you're safe in these ways is very important. Next. So are you in a good place emotionally? This one is set, right? I have it's covering part of my screen, but I think we've gone into set. So one of the most important things when you are engaging in psychedelic use is checking in with yourself to find out where you're at emotionally. If you're in a very vulnerable emotional spot, psychedelics might not be a good choice for you at that time, because where you're at in your mind can absolutely influence your trip, where you go, your journey, and it can actually hinder some of the emotional work and process work you're trying to do if you're not in a place to do it. And if you're not open and ready to do that work also, that can actually cause more problems than it will solve. Next. So discussing and writing down your intentions, I think that this is also incredibly important. You know, writing down your intentions for what it is you're seeking, what you'd like to get out of it, what you'd like to learn, what you'd like to find out about yourself, writing those down and talking about them even with other people who are going on your journey with you, or with other people that understand the journey that you're embarking on, and talking about what you'd like to get, because when we put that out there, God brings it back to us. And that's an important piece about psychedelics, is what we put out there comes back to us. And so keeping yourself in a good place and really directing where you want your heart to go is important. Next. Being in a safe place to communicate is also incredibly important. And in my opinion, I think the set in which you're where you're partaking of these activities is probably the most important piece, you know. And as things are happening when you're using psychedelics, you need to be able to communicate that And sometimes that's difficult anyway, but it's especially difficult if you're not with people that you feel safe to express that to. So I can't stress it enough that you should always be engaging in these things with people who feel safe to you and that you feel safe to be vulnerable with, because that's how we process and heal. Next. Setting boundaries. Boundaries are incredibly important when you are using psychedelics. There's obviously a psychedelic impact, and it is totally fine to say, these are the things that I need during this journey. These are the things that I don't want around me in this journey. Like bad energies, negative people, certain kinds of settings, certain environments, they're not helpful to the work that we're trying to do. So setting those boundaries for yourself is incredibly important. And if the people you're setting those boundaries with are not receptive to them or not respecting them, those aren't the right people to be journeying with. Next. Dropping your expectations. So this is huge. So psychedelics, all of them, are different for everybody. And people sometimes have this idea that they're going to go in and they're going to have this mind-blowing experience and their whole life's going to be laid out in front of them. They're going to have all the answers. And that's not usually the case. And in fact, when using psychedelics, they're just a piece of it. The real work has to come after. And we'll talk about that in integration. But when people go in with these high expectations, they can miss the message that their higher power or the universe is trying to send to them, because they have these expectations of what it's supposed to be. And control is an illusion anyway, but this is an example of when we as human beings try to control what's going on around us. And it's not helpful for your trip. It's not helpful for your journey. And just letting yourself go in, knowing that the universe, your higher power, that God has got you and is taking you where you're supposed to go is a really important component. Next. And it goes along with that, allowing your higher power to lead. People that, it's one thing to have an intention. And sometimes when people go into a trip with an intention, they'll end up in a completely different place because it's not up to us, right? But it's been my experience that, and I call my higher power God because it's the easiest thing. But it's been my experience that God takes me everywhere I need to go, and that his love is always with me, always around me, and especially surrounding me when I'm utilizing psychedelics. And I trust that God is taking me everywhere I'm supposed to go and helping me heal in the ways that I'm supposed to. Next, the setting. Dun, dun, dun. First fly in. Okay. So first of all, are you dosing alone? And I think you can click on this because there's a couple little pieces that go with this. So you could click. Yep. Okay. So if you are dosing alone, tell someone what you're taking, how much you're taking, where you're taking it at, so that you can ensure that you are going to be safe and that somebody knows how to help you if you need help. I would not recommend dosing alone, especially in the beginning. It's safer depending on the psychedelic you're using. It depends on which one you're using as to whether I think it's safe to use it alone very often. But you want to make sure that if you are taking it alone, that you're always safe and that people know how to, not everybody, but that somebody knows how to get to you. And you also want to ensure that you're in a safe place, free of chaos, and being with safe people. That's and also, like I talked about that earlier, that's an incredibly important piece, because if you're not with safe people, if you're not in a safe place, that's going to take you to a different place that is not where you were trying to go, I'm sure. Make sure you have plenty of water. Psychedelics are very dehydrating. Next, wear layers, especially if you are journeying in nature. I've seen this happen before. People start on a journey with psilocybin and it was sunny outside when they left, and now it's cold and it's dark and they're in the mountains and they didn't bring anything but their t-shirt. So make sure you wear layers, that you have extra water, food, whatever it is that you need, so that you make sure you're not stuck somewhere without what you need to be okay. Next. So a few other important harm reduction tips. This is what we say to people in every aspect of harm reduction. Start low and slow. If you have never used psychedelics before, you should not go take a hero's dose on your first time. You can always take more if you're not getting the effects you're looking for, but you can't take back what you've already ingested. So you want to make sure that you are starting at a lower dose and then figure out what works best for you as you go. They're not going anywhere, so just do what's safe for you. Do not go off your medications. So this is one where so as a clinician, I have some different viewpoints on this than sometimes some like shamans maybe would have. Because for instance, if you're engaging in an ayahuasca ceremony, it says on, in your introduction or whatever that, don't take any pharmaceutical medications for 2 weeks prior to ceremony. And that is not something that any shaman should be saying first and foremost. Like no one anybody that's not a medical professional should not be telling people to go off their medications. People going off their medications can cause so many problems, and it can actually interrupt a trip, and it can make you think things or bring things from your trip that were not there. So if you're on medications and you're looking into doing psychedelics, because that's another thing. So antidepressants and other types of medications actually make or not work as well. So if you want to engage in psychedelic healing and work with your higher power through psychedelics, you need to coordinate with your doctor to taper properly from your medications if that's what's necessary. Do not encourage other people to do things that may be harmful for them. And that includes encouraging other people to go off medications, unless your doctor and their doctor, specifically their prescriber, you don't have any business telling people to go off their medications. I think there are certain things that are not good for certain people, and no two people are the same. So everyone needs to guide their own journey as to what's best for them. And I do hope that people work with the professionals in their lives to be able to do those things in the safest way possible without causing harm to themselves. Be smart when partaking. Yes. Okay, so let's also remember psychedelics are illegal, my friends. We'd like to see that change very quickly and very soon. But in the meantime, psychedelics are illegal, and you have to pay attention to that. You need to pay attention to that when you're thinking about where you're partaking, who you're partaking with, where you're getting them. All of those things can absolutely cause harm. So keeping in mind that even though we love them, psychedelics are still illegal. And one of the other important things is that God is love. I find this to be one of the most important harm reduction tips when utilizing psychedelics, because so many things can happen when you're on psychedelics, and sometimes you have to take a look at some things that are hard to look at and make some changes that can be hard. And the thing that carries me through all those is knowing that it's all in my best interest from the power that's greater than myself, this divine energy that is leading me to heal, and I'm surrounded with love all of the time. And so remembering that always reminds me that I'm in a good place, even when I feel like I'm not, even when I'm working through hard things, if that makes sense. So I flew through those a little faster than I thought I would. I guess I'm excited. So I guess now we can just open it up for questions, answers, and discussion.
Oop, I was speaking on mute.
Babe, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I was on mute. Imagine that. So this first question is from David. He's asking about the pre-consumption slide, how someone finds out information about those specific psychedelics. I remember it talked about dosing, how much and stuff like that. I don't remember the other things on that slide, but I'm sure you do. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like he's asking about how to find out about those psychedelics and how much is a proper dosage and all that. Okay.
He didn't specifically bring out dose, but the other things that were on that slide as well, yes.
Yeah, okay. So it's interesting. I have found that with psychedelics, often they come to you. They come to you when the time is right. The right people will present themselves in your life, and you'll be able to obtain those things. As far as dosage goes, it really depends on the substance. So if you're partaking in ayahuasca, it's given in these different doses. You get to choose your dose depending on what kind of effect you're looking for, but you always have a guide there or a shaman that is guiding the ceremony that can help you with those dosages. When it comes to psilocybin, that's the one especially like go low and slow. You can always eat more later, right? So if people are microdosing, they're taking somewhere between a quarter gram and maybe even up to a gram, right? That's usually considered microdosing. A large dose would be considered usually like 3 grams or higher. But again, like the hero's dose is 5 grams or more. So it really all just depends. And it also depends on the strain. That's another thing. There's like lots of different strains of things. So with psilocybin specifically, if you're using like an albino avery versus a rusty white, the albino averies are way stronger. And so you want to adjust your dose accordingly. And also, that's another important thing about knowing the strains and stuff, and also knowing where you got them from, because I know that the energy of the person who is growing them is in those plants. So I want people who have good energy, and I want to know what have other people's experiences been with this certain strain, right? There's certain strains that can feel angrier, that can feel angry. There's some that are very, very happy and loving. Mushrooms are actually known as tricksters. So knowing which strain produces what kind of effects and what kind of energies those bring, that can be very important for you as well.
Thanks. We got a question from Yvonne. They're asking, could you repeat what you said about antidepressants and psychedelics?
So psychedelics, and I can actually send Steve a handout on this that maybe he could get sent out. But psychedelics, well, antidepressants specifically make psychedelics not work in the brain. So people who are, and there's also certain other kinds of medications too. So I have this whole list, and I'll get it sent to Steve so he can forward it to people who are looking into that. But typically, but specifically antidepressants make psychedelics either not work at all or work very little. And that's one of the dangerous things is people who are on antidepressants are like, well, then I'll just go off my antidepressant so that I can, engage in psychedelics. And that's just not a good idea. And also, so as a clinician, you should know that like when people are on medication, when you first start taking medication, you get up here and you stabilize, right? And you're when you go off medication, and then when you get back on the medication, you only go to here, and then the next time to here. And so medication stops being as effective, and medication isn't necessary for everybody, and it is necessary for some. And so we just need to be careful to be supporting people in the way that is going to be helpful for them without causing them more harm, because sending somebody into a psychotic break is not helpful. Or nice.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up in this discussion about safety, because I have heard of people being told, get off your medicines and stuff like that. And that could be extremely dangerous. So another question is,
it's incredibly dangerous, especially if somebody has a psychotic disorder. Oh my gosh.
Right. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in the assessment session as well. So Steve is asking, can you share what you think a good guide is, and how should someone prepare for a first communion? I know you were talking about staying off of coffee right now. I wonder if he's kind of talking about, I don't know, if you could answer that.
Yeah, so it depends on what you're partaking of. So, well, okay, first of all, finding a good guide. I feel like guides come to you. I think that when you're ready, the divine presents it to you, and the right person will come. Like I had opportunities to do ayahuasca ceremonies earlier in life, and I didn't because the energy just wasn't right. Like the person who was going to be the guide, it was just like their energy was just too chauvinistic, too like egotistical, and I didn't want to do that, and I didn't know what kind of people that would be there either. And so, but then the right person through these connections like has come to me, and it presents itself. So I think that's important. Somebody's energy is incredibly important. And also, so this is, I think the guides are the best to take people through the actual journey and trip. But I think that we could do a much better job of making sure that guides are aware of the real harms that can come for people who struggle with mental illnesses and such, or addiction, suicidality, those things, and recognizes that it's not just black and white, like we have to do it this way and that's it. And it's like, well, that's not what's best for me. Well, that's the way we do it. That's not a good guide for you then.
Thanks. This is a good follow-up. Trevor asks, shaman sounds suspect to me. He says, I guess more latently religious or spiritual color of shamans versus a guide. What is the difference between a shaman and a guide?
Well, I look at them, I guess I sort of look at them the same, except for I guess I would look at a guide like they have maybe less training, you know, like, because I think a lot of people feel called to guide people in psychedelics, but don't necessarily have what is proper and necessary to be doing that work. I think shamans are typically much more trained, but I also, so some of my issues as a clinician using psychedelics in a therapeutic way, some of my issues are with some of the shamanic beliefs, because like shamans I have talked to and done work with, they tend to, like, they completely throw out Western medicine altogether. And that's like, it's fine to not love Western medicine, but there are real disorders, there are real things that need to be addressed and looked at. And I think that sometimes those things just get tossed right out the window, which isn't safe for people, because of these deep-seated, like, religious or shamanic beliefs that, get in the way of sometimes of people being practical. Oh, Sarah, I also think it's tied to dogma. I'm with you. I agree. If someone is too strident, there's a red flag for me. Yes. If they make this, yes. I'm going to read Sarah's comment in case everybody didn't see it. It says, I also think it's tied to dogma. If someone is too strident, that is a red flag for me. If they make the ceremony about them, absolutely. Like, ceremonies are about your healing. And that's why I say, if somebody just ignores like the things that are best for you, then yeah, to me, that's a red flag. And it's somebody who's not always that there are in the world for everything.
So our next question is, what are some of the potential dangers of a trip, and how can a good guide help mitigate those potential dangers?
So I think the biggest danger really, I'm sorry, I'm just moving around. I think the biggest danger when it comes to psychedelics is just if people go on a bad trip. Because psychedelics, you can't die from mushrooms, you can't overdose on mushrooms or ayahuasca, DMT, none of them can cause you death or, real physical harm, but people can cause themselves real physical harm under the influence of psychedelics if they're in a bad place with bad people. I have a friend who stabbed himself in the stomach and cut all the way down, almost killed himself, because he thought that Jesus told him to. These things do happen. This is why not all people are appropriate for psychedelics. They're not for everyone. And having a good guide or a buddy with you, or, somebody that can help you to do breathing, like deep breathing is one of the best things that you can do, because the nervous system gets all, and so if your nervous system doesn't have a choice but to calm down. So having somebody who can help you remember to breathe, who can hold you if that's what you need, that's why it's the safety, the being with people who feel safe to you. That's why that's so important. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a guide. For instance, like, I feel incredibly safe journeying with Steve, because I know that he would be right there if something, like if I was starting to and I've done a lot of psychedelics, so I don't go on bad trips, but like if I would need somebody that's familiar and close, that's what would calm me down, so it's all about the safety. I think it's about the trust and the connection. It's also why I'm not a big fan of like journeying with strangers. Stranger danger. Some people love strangers. I feel much safer with people that I know will not let anything happen to me or let me do anything to myself.
seems to be a common theme throughout all the panelists. What I'm hearing is, make sure you get to know these people in advance and understand what you're getting into. And if it doesn't feel right when you step into these rooms or into the time, don't be shy to step away.
Absolutely. And I prefer to do this work with friends, people that I'm close to, people that I've done this work with before, people who know my darkness. You know, I have some parts of my past that are pretty dark, and the last thing I want when I'm trying to work through something like that is somebody to judge me, or to feel like they don't understand what it's like to be in this trip where you're trying to figure out how to forgive yourself for not being the mom you needed to be. Like I have to be with people who know and understand me and don't judge me.
For sure. Brian has a question. It's taking us in a little different direction. How serious is law enforcement about psychedelics in contrast to other drugs like opioids? Are there people out there getting busted for mushrooms? It's a good question.
No, not really. No, because mushrooms, they're actually, until you're drying them and have them in their form of magic mushrooms, they're actually not illegal until then. And I haven't, in all my years of having to deal with law enforcement on lots of levels, like psychedelics is never the one they were ever harassing me for, but make no mistake, like if you are caught with them in your possession, you will go to jail, especially if you're caught with something like LSD or ecstasy. Like the more man-made ones, they get way more serious about that too.
Mr. Potts asks, how about the antidepressants that act as an MOAI, where it will be, so the question is, where it will increase and extend a tryptamine trip to scary levels and lengths? Is that something you're familiar with?
I am not as familiar with that. We were actually talking about the MAOIs last night. There's certain plant medicines that have MAOI in them. And you do partake of it before ceremony often, if you're in an ayahuasca ceremony. But I mean, anytime that you're on any kind of medications, you should, and like I said, I'll be sending that handout thing to Steve so you can kind of see the cross references of the medications, because I certainly don't have all those memorized. I don't prescribe medication. That's not what I do. But yeah, as psychedelics become more popular. Yeah. Sorry, I see the things too. Yeah, I'm reading people's comments, sorry, as I'm seeing these. So anyway, but you should always consult, like do some research, consult with your physician. Your physician, though, is likely not going to know shit about medications and psychedelics, though. So you should consult, like MAPS is a great source. Psychedelics Today, they have a lot of really great information. So yeah, do research, get the answers. And if you think you're going to go off your medications to engage in psychedelic work, do talk to your prescriber about that. Just going off a medication is really bad for everybody, no matter what.
So in your presentation, you talked about making sure you're in a good place emotionally. I'm wondering, what if, that's what we're working on and that's what we're trying to work through. That's their intention behind this. How do you balance being in a good place emotionally and using psychedelics as medicine and to find that spiritual healing?
I would say, so when I say ask yourself if you're in a good place emotionally, like, are you in a place where you're open and ready to heal? Because if you're in a place where you're like depressed, you're suicidal, you're crying hysterically, not a good time to partake in journey, because it's probably not going to be very great. So getting yourself to this place of calm and centered and being open and ready for the healing to come in, and making sure that you're not already angry, super irritated about something. You've got this thing going on, your baby dad is doing whatever, like not a good time to partake. Get those things out of your mind, clear your system, get those energies out, and be in a place of at least neutral energy when you partake of psychedelics.
Thanks. Kimball asks, do psychedelics assist people getting off of their antidepressants? Have you seen that in people?
Have what? I'm sorry.
Psychedelics assist people getting off of their antidepressants.
Yes, that it, well, I wouldn't say that it's the psychedelics assisting people to get off their antidepressants, but you can do work through psychedelics that can take away the source of that depression, the source of that anxiety. And I've also been told that there are that there are compounds in ayahuasca and some of the other plant-based medicines used in ayahuasca ceremonies that actually heal those neuroreceptors. I'm going to have the neurotransmitters. I'm going to have to look into that and see that research for myself. Because I haven't actually seen that research. I need to see how it was conducted and such, but I'm very hopeful for those kind of things. But as a practitioner, I also know that the root of depression and anxiety, specifically those two, that there's a root to it. There's something to it. And sometimes it's in birthing trauma, sometimes it's past life trauma, sometimes it's current life trauma. But those are the things psychedelics can absolutely help lift out. And so I could absolutely see people being able to go off their medication at some point because they don't need it, because medication is for symptom management in many cases. But no, psychedelics are not going to heal us like psychosis or anything like that. So let's not get crazy.
I'm having trouble processing something. So if antidepressants can block the psychedelics from working, and we're suggesting that people don't go off of their antidepressants to take psychedelics, how do you bridge that? How can you get to a place where psychedelics can help you heal if you're on antidepressants and you can't, then these psychedelics aren't going to be working for you?
Yeah. So that's why I say taper, like talk to your doctor about tapering, or maybe even going on a lower dose, saying, hey, I want to do this work and it doesn't work with my medication, at least not at this level. And talking with your doctor and saying, how can we either titrate, taper all the way off, or how can we lower my dose? And you could be utilizing psychedelics during that time. It just might not work, but then you can also see like, well, if my medication's down to this dose and I took this dose of mushrooms and then I finally felt it. So then you could figure out like, hey, okay, this is where it can work for me.
That makes
But
sense.
doing that in coordination with professionals is necessary. When it comes
Definitely.
to medication, professionals are necessary.
So question, it's a follow-up from Steve. He says, can you talk about guides and ego?
Ah, Steve, I feel like you're setting me up here. No. Yeah, so it's interesting because as I've seen psychedelics become more like mainstream, right? They're sort of hip and trendy. I see lots of people emerge that are like, oh, I'm a guide. I can guide people on trips. And it's like, just because you have gone on a trip yourself does not mean you can guide people. But when people are doing that, when they make the trip about you, like when Sarah said earlier, like something, let me see if I can scroll down to it. But anyway, when Sarah was saying that when people are really strident and that it has to be this way, that's a red flag for her. That to me is also about ego. Like when one person is telling everybody else like how they should do this because they're the one with the answers, like to me, that's ego. Like I know for sure that the divine does not grant me grace based upon my behaviors or based upon what I consume. Like, I am
What do
not
you mean by
gonna.
that?
So specifically, like when you're going to do like an ayahuasca ceremony, right? So for 2 weeks prior, they don't want you to utilize cannabis or alcohol. And usually for at least 48 days prior, you can't eat red meat, pork, like caffeine, spices, fermented things, oils, like all sorts of stuff, right? And I know for sure that whether I consume any of those things or not, that God's not going to grant me less of an opening, less of a trip, less healing because I fucking drank caffeine 3 days ago. Like I have a very personal relationship with my creator. And God has saved me from the darkest places when I did not deserve it. I have been granted so much grace in the darkest moments of my life. I know for sure that when I am seeking healing, it is not contingent upon what I'm putting into my body. It's not contingent upon whether I follow all these little rules or not. And when people are like, well, it must be this way, this way, this way, to me, that's more about ego. When people are telling me about how my trip should be, what I should be doing, that's not about me. That's about them.
Yeah, I've heard some people when they're prepping for these things, they can't even eat a pickle.
Yeah.
Like, a
And it's like,
pickle? But
yeah,
I don't understand the idea behind that. But for me, I would think a pickle would be okay for a week. but I don't
Yeah.
know.
And I respect people who do the dieta and like, which is the diet. And I tried to adhere to it like to the best of my abilities, but without like when I was like, no, that's just not something I'm willing to do. I'm going to still do that. Like for instance, cannabis, I'm a medical cannabis patient. So I continue to engage in cannabis and it hasn't changed anything for me, so, but I respect those traditions and I respect, what it is there, the reasonings for why that's there. And I respect people who follow it to the T. And I hope that people respect me and others who are like, you know what, this is what's best for me. Because I know what's better for me. I know what's best for me better than somebody else does for sure. And I don't give a shit if they're a shaman, a medical provider, a counselor. I don't care. As a therapist, I don't know what's better for you than you do. I can help you try to find it, but I'm not the one with the answers. You are. I'm just the one that's helping you try to find them. And that's what your guide should be. Just somebody who's trying to help you find your answers. They're not trying to give them to you.
So yesterday you and I chatted a little bit and you brought up the term psychosis and I remember thinking, what's the difference between psychosis and a spiritual emergence? Can you talk to me a little bit about that? There seems to be a little overlap, but maybe I'm just out of my mind to bring that.
Well, some people call a spiritual emergence a spiritual emergency. And it can be like small things or it can be something big that changes your perspective, changes like it's like a spiritual awakening, right? They can be little ones, they can be big ones. Sometimes spiritual emergence comes in the form of what we would say in the Western world would be psychosis, which would be hallucinations, delusions, voices, hearing and seeing things other people aren't hearing and seeing. And so there's a very fine line because in more traditional settings like spiritual emergence or even what I would call psychosis is welcomed as they're gifted and it's a special gift but there's real psychosis in the world. There are people who truly have psychotic disorders. They have schizophrenia, schizoaffective. And Shala, you're my new favorite person too. So yeah, like distinguishing, not lumping everything into one. So I find that oftentimes it's very separated. It's like either you're in the medical model or you're in the, spiritual medicinal kind of model, but that's not the case. Like, so I think it's important for each situation to be looked at in its uniqueness and looking at the other pieces to it besides just maybe the one instance of spiritual emergence or the one psychotic break, like looking at it as a whole and seeing, is this a psychotic break or is this somebody who's just coming through? I don't know another way to say that.
So Sandy asks, can you talk about the personal trauma healing versus intergenerational trauma?
Ooh, well, okay, yes. And so we have our own trauma, right, that we can work on through these medicines. It's also been my experience though that the trauma came from generations behind and it will go to generations ahead. Each generation has their own work to do and they have their own thing that they add on to it, their own traumas that they add on. And until we do the work, the trauma continues to carry. So I think that when you're doing your own personal trauma work, you are doing intergenerational trauma work.
For sure.
And then there's other times like when you're in, like, if you're in an ayahuasca journey, right? Like there's times that you could be sitting with your ancestors or sitting with your grandmother and healing that kind of intergenerational trauma where it's like, yeah, this is totally intergenerational. But when you really look at it, it is intergenerational anyway.
Kelly, I don't know if you saw this one, but Kelly said, mad props, Mindy. You're doing incredible, necessary, somewhat risky work. Total respect.
Oh, thank you.
So we got a question from Trevor. He says, what are the differences between some of the more common psychedelics in their potential bad trips? Are there any specific things to avoid within a given medium, plant, or substance? The question I've never thought about.
To avoid going on a bad trip?
I think he's more asking, is there specific bad trips associated with certain psychedelics?
Oh,
and
that's a really good question. I don't think so, except for, so with ayahuasca, I wouldn't say it's bad trips, but in ayahuasca, it's it's different than mushrooms or like LSD or something. Like, so with ayahuasca, sometimes people have to see things that or feel things that were painful, but it's also completely surrounded in love. So for some people that might feel like a bad trip, but because like what they had to look at wasn't pleasant, but they came out of it very grateful and with a lot of healing, right? So um yeah, I would say that if you're looking at bad trips in that way, that it would be the ayahuasca would maybe be one that would bring that more, but it brings more healing, I think, too. And there's more clarity about that. When you go on, like if somebody has a bad trip on mushrooms or LSD, it's really quite different. And that usually, when I see that happen, that happens because people are with the wrong people in the wrong places, or they weren't in the right mental state to be consuming psychedelics.
I've heard I've one common theme I've heard when it comes to ayahuasca is the Madre, seen as some kind of maternal figure. Is that something you've noticed, a
Yeah.
common thread?
Yes. Yep, she is Madre. And some people call her grandmother, but ayahuasca is definitely a feminine, loving energy. It reminds me of like nurturing, like when you picture like a mom holding her little baby around, like and wrapping herself around him, like almost as if they're in the womb. That's what ayahuasca feels like to me.
That's beautiful. So we have
And peyote's grandfather. Yes.
so we have a couple minutes left. Do you wanna have any closing? Do you have any closing thoughts? Just maybe reiterate some of the major points in terms of safety and harm reduction that people should really take away from this session.
Just the main things are is that, psychedelics aren't appropriate for everybody. Make sure you're prepared because you just never know, and that's one of my favorite things when I'm journeying is I like not knowing. I like, consuming and seeing where God takes me and where he wants me to go. So I need to be prepared physically for those things, meaning I need to have a jacket or whatever that could be, right? It's just making sure that you have those basic things. And the most important thing I could say is just making sure that you are in the right place with the right people.
I love that. And I really love your point of I want to try and hammer this through as much as possible, working with your doctor and not just coming off of your medicines and not taking a shaman or a guide's recommendations that could be potentially very dangerous.
Right, because shamans do know the plants really well. Like a good shaman is amazing, right? And they don't know a lot about mental illness typically, like real mental illness. And that's something that has to be taken into account. Sandy, thank you. She said, I
Well,
emanate your love. That makes me almost cry.
well,
That's a
we
big deal. I just came out of ceremony, so that means a lot to me. Thank you.